All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of Art Brunch, where we explore the wisdom of the arts, spirituality, and the great ideas. I'm so glad to have you here, especially our newcomers, so welcome. We're continuing our series. In the first three episodes, I guess, presentations in the series, I really concentrated on the wisdom of wealth. Today, we're going to look at both wisdom and folly of wealth. Subtitle of this is Rags to Riches to Rags. Again, that's not obviously original to me. Other people have used that phrase to describe the family that I'm going to describe in a little bit here. Now, all of the patriarchs of wealthy families that we have looked at had two things in common. I'm talking about the patriarchs, the ones who really catapulted the family's wealth. The two attributes they had were frugality and avoiding ostentatious displays of wealth. These are sometimes called old money habits. Now, I want to make clear right off the start, we all need a certain level of wealth in order to live a full and meaningful life. Recall again the definition of wealth as I have presented it. Wealth is having the freedom and the resources to accomplish a worthy goal. In that sense, Mahatma Gandhi was one of the wealthiest men of the 20th century. He had the freedom of time and all of the resources available to him, benefactors, in other words, that he needed in order to liberate the Indian people. I'd like to say now that our spiritual traditions, all of them, acknowledge the importance of wealth. The Sanskrit word of artha, which is a prominent idea in both Hinduism and Buddhism, translates broadly as career, skills, health, wealth, prosperity, and the means or resources needed for a fulfilling life. In Hinduism, it is one of the four goals of human life, the other goals being dharma, which is the moral life, kama, which refers to pleasure or emotional fulfillment, and moksha, which is liberation. But having enough wealth is right there with those other three. Oh, good. Alexandra is joining us. I'd also like to take a moment to recommend this book to you by Jacob Needleman, Money and the Meaning of Life. Now, 2 or 3 years ago, I gave a presentation on wealth, and I spoke about this book at length. I don't have the time to speak about it at length here, but it has really inspired this series. And in that book, Needleman states, a human being, according to the great spiritual teachings of the world, has two natures or aspects. A side that is meant to be engaged in activity in the world, making and doing, having a family, creating, building, including building wealth, I want to add for context. The other side has to do with the spiritual, the transcendent, the relationship to God, one's deepest inner consciousness. Those two natures make up who we are. We are called on to find the relationship between these two opposing parts of ourselves and to develop the kind of awareness that relates each to the other in a harmonious way. I'll let that sink in a little bit. I'm going to quote something else in a little bit. Go ahead and read that over again while I close the door that I need to do. There are some teachers that teach that we must choose between the two worlds, the external, physical, material world, and the quote-unquote spiritual life, the internal life. Needleman doesn't think so. In fact, he believes that most spiritual traditions teach that we need to navigate both worlds in a harmonious way. He goes on to say, there are things we need to do which are totally untouched by money. But listen to this, in order to do them, we need money. We need to have money in order to engage in the kind of spiritual search and the kinds of activities that money can't buy. I'll add, like spiritually and psychologically expansive experiences. We need wealth, some level of wealth, to make those possible. Those are the kinds of experiences that make life worth living. Now, to introduce our next family, I'd like to offer this proverb as well. Precious treasure remains in the house of the wise, but the fool devours it. The patriarch of this next family was wise when it came to money. Like the other patriarchs I mentioned, he lived by frugality and avoiding ostentatious displays of wealth. Many of the descendants of this patriarch, however, did not live according to those precepts. The Vanderbilt name is synonymous with most of us with old money. However, the spending habits of some members of the family were more like the stereotype of new money. The patriarch of this wealthy family, Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt, that was his nickname, Commodore, built a steamship and railway empire using, listen to this, a $100 loan from his mother that he got in 1810. Starting with just a single boat, he grew his fleet until he was competing with Robert Fulton for dominance of the New York waterways. His energy, courage, hard work, and ambition earned him the nickname, the Commodore. When the Commodore started his business, Robert Fulton's company had a monopoly on trade in and out of New York Harbor, and the shipping laws at the time favored Fulton. But Vanderbilt, who was based in New Jersey at the time, flouted the law, steaming in and out of New York Harbor under the flag that read, quote, New Jersey must be free, unquote. Now, he had to hire an attorney, you may have heard of this attorney, Daniel Webster, to argue against Fulton's monopoly before the United States Supreme Court. And Vanderbilt won, thereby establishing an early precedent for the United States' first laws of interstate commerce. From the time of that court decision, Vanderbilt's business thrived, outdoing all other shipping companies. Commodore Vanderbilt was so successful that by the end of his life, he had turned that $100 investment from his mother into a $100 million fortune. This is the 19th century, $100 million. I don't know what that would be in today's money, but it would make him probably much more wealthy than Jeff Bezos. The Commodore left about 90% of his enormous fortune to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. William Henry, though, increased the profitability of his father's holdings, expanded the reach of the New York Central Railroad, which he owned, and doubled the Vanderbilt wealth. He was the only heir to increase the Vanderbilt fortune. Now, the Commodore, his father, was known for frugality and avoiding extravagant expenditures. Not so his offspring, including William Henry. William Henry Vanderbilt built the first of what would become many grand Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue in New York City. This home is known as the triple home because it combined multiple mansions. In addition to this enormous home, William Henry also spent his fortune on art. I commend him for that, amassing a wonderful collection of European masters. The home no longer exists, so for images of his collection, I need to rely on pictures from this book. William Henry Vanderbilt's art collection was more accessible than any other private collection in the early postbellum era. He offered his fellow wealthy New Yorkers a rare opportunity to enter his home and become more familiar with contemporary European art. On the left, above the bookcase, is Jean-Louis Gérôme's reception of the Duc de Conde at Versailles. Vanderbilt formed his prodigious collection of over 200 paintings in less than 4 years. That's amazingly swift by any collecting standards. On the right is a colossal 9-foot-high vase made of brilliant green malachite with applied gilded allegorical figures representing fame. That's important now, representing fame. Now, the art that we own, I've taught this before, should express our values, shouldn't it? The Vanderbilts had an obsession about impressing their fellow New York society elites. Because they were considered new money, they worked very hard in spending it in ways to ingratiate themselves among New York City's old money families. Here is the actual painting by Jean-Louis Gérôme, kind of blown up. Notice the theme, the grandeur of powerful and wealthy people. Very fitting for William Henry and the other descendants of the Commodore. So every nook and cranny of the Vanderbilt home expressed opulence and the finer things. Walls and ceilings were covered with murals. Every entryway was not spared a touch of extravagance. As you can see by now, every single area of William Henry's home was adorned with art, even the staircases. William Henry followed closely the exhibitions in Europe, particularly the annual exhibitions in Paris. Vanderbilt bought this painting in 1878, the same year that the artist Raimondo de Madrazo won the first-class medal at the Exposition Universelle in Paris. In this scene, a couple dressed in extravagant costumes shared drinks in a quiet conservatory after a ball. The Vanderbilts, in their attempts to impress their peers, threw lavish parties, so a painting like this one was fitting. Notice how the artist bathes in light the couple, making the satin, fur, porcelain, glass, feather, and velvet all shimmer. Now, I want to give credit where credit is due. The subject of this Millet work is indeed a humble one. William Henry knew a classic work of art when he saw it, even if it didn't necessarily express his values of opulence and extravagance. He owned this work. J.M.W. Turner needs no introduction to this community. William Henry also collected the pre-Raphaelites like John Everett Millet. And he chose this grand work by Eugene Delacroix. Notice again the subject. This is how William Henry and family wanted to present themselves to their fellow New Yorkers. and it's how they wanted to be received as well. But it was William Henry's brother, Cornelius, who used his paltry inheritance of 5 million. Remember, William Henry got 90% of the 100 million. Cornelius got 5 million, but he used it to live even more lavishly. He also patronized the arts in a significant way. But Cornelius stated that, quote, "I want to dominate the plaza," and by which he meant the corner of West 57th Street and Fifth Avenue in New York City. I want to dominate the plaza. Now, Cornelius already had a home on the block, but he worried that other elite New Yorkers were trying to outdo his house. So he constructed a much larger mansion than the one he was living in, filling the entire block front. The expansion, listen to this, cost $3 million. Remember what he inherited, $5 million. The expansion cost $3 million. Once completed, it contained approximately 154 rooms. Many of the interiors were imported from Europe. The house was 6 stories tall, not including the basement, and also had a stable and a private garden next door. The mansion was the largest single-family house in New York City at the time. Now, it would be demolished in the 1920s to make way for a department store. This is the mantelpiece which dominated the entrance hall of the residence. It's a good example of the lavish decorative program for the home, and I think it's clear he was competing with his much wealthier older brother. The mosaic depicts a classically dressed woman holding a garland, expressing love, amor, and peace, pax. The Latin phrase of hospitality flanking her head may be translated as, "The house at its threshold gives evidence of the master's goodwill. Welcome to the guest who arrives. Farewell and helpfulness to him who departs." Now, nothing but the very best in art would do for Cornelius Vanderbilt's art collection. This is Rosa Bonheur's best-known painting, showing the horse market held in Paris on the tree-lined Boulevard de l'Hôpital. Rosa Bonheur was already well established in France and in Europe when the painting debuted at the Paris Salon of 1853. And when it did, it received wide praise in all of the newspapers. Now, such a lavish home was not enough for Cornelius. He needed a summer home as well to get away from the city heat. So between 1893 and 1895, he built the Breakers. Listen to this, for $7 million. Now, considering he only inherited around $5 million, he had incredible confidence in his ability to carry on in the family shipping business. The Breakers has 70 rooms with a gross area of 138,300 square feet on 5 floors. Now, Vanderbilt died from a cerebral hemorrhage caused by a stroke in 1899. He was only 55. His wife, Alice, never remarried and continued to live in the New York City mansion and in Newport. The New York City mansion was never opened again to friends, and the only functions that are known to have happened there were the funerals of her 2 sons. It was inhabited only by Alice and the 37 servants needed to run the mansion. She wasn't much of a socialite. In 1934, Alice left the Breakers when she died to her youngest daughter. I may not be able to pronounce this correctly, Countess Gladys Szczeciny. Gladys was a generous woman. She needed to be, by the way, but she was a generous woman. In 1948, she leased the high maintenance property to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 per year. Unfortunately, Gladys was also no businesswoman, neither was her husband. Ultimately, the Preservation Society bought the breakers and approximately 90% of its furnishings in 1972 for, get this, $365,000. Remember, it cost $7 million at the end of the 19th century, and in 1972, it was purchased for $365,000. Not the best investment the Vanderbilts ever made. Now, the Preservation Society agreed to allow the family to continue to live on the third floor, which was not open to the public. The occupancy ended in 2018 when the residents were evicted by the Preservation Society. The Breakers is now the most visited attraction in Rhode Island, with approximately 450,000 visitors annually as of 2017. Cornelius II's brother, William Kissam Vanderbilt, was also a lavish spender. He particularly loved horse racing. He married a woman determined as well to spend whatever it took to ingratiate herself into New York's elite and old money families. William also built a home on Fifth Avenue, which he called Petit Chateau. Here is the home, and on the right, his first wife, Alva Vanderbilt, at her official opening of the chateau in March 1883. For the occasion, she held a masquerade ball for 1,000 guests, reportedly costing the equivalent in today's money of $3 million. That must have been some party. Now, William Kissam was a ladies' man. Alva found out about a mistress he had, and he ended up in a very costly divorce with Alva. He then moved to France and purchased this chateau, designing a racehorse park right by the home. And like other family members, William also liked to summer in Newport, Rhode Island. So he built this house named the Marble House. As you can see from the interior photo, he spared no expense. Like other Vanderbilt mansions, it's now owned by a preservation society. George Washington Vanderbilt II was the youngest son of William Henry Vanderbilt and was a very bookish Vanderbilt. He would go on to Yale University. He possibly outdid all of his siblings as an art collector. Well, it helps when your mother leaves your deceased father's entire art collection to you, all 200 works, which he received. Good for him. George also liked to live in extravagant mansions. He constructed Biltmore Estate on 125,000 acres near Asheville, North Carolina. The 250-room mansion with 175,856 square feet of floor space is the largest house in the United States. The estate was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1963. It remains a major tourist attraction in Western North Carolina, with around 1.4 million visitors each year. Now, the latest assessment for this house that I found on the internet was that it's valued at $157 million. I do believe it is still owned by the Vanderbilt family. I mentioned George Washington Vanderbilt as an art lover. This ceiling mural in the library at the Biltmore is Giovanni Pellegrini's The Chariot of Aurora. It was painted in the 1720s and originally graced the ceiling of the Pisani Palace in Venice, Italy. Nothing but the finest for George Washington Vanderbilt. Now, to George's credit, He was also a philanthropist to Yale University, paying for the construction of several campus buildings. Education is one of these significant ways wealth can bring a highly impactful legacy. After he died in 1914, his art collection passed into the hands of George's nephew, Brigadier General Cornelius Vanderbilt, whose wife, Grace Wilson Vanderbilt, after the general died, sold the collection at auction. In fact, most of the Vanderbilt family art collection ended up being sold to pay off debts and their continued lavish lifestyle. Now, my favorite by far of all the Vanderbilts is Cornelius Vanderbilt II's second daughter, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. She was an artist, a sculptor, an art patron, and a collector. And she was the founder of the Whitney Museum of Art in New York. Here are a few of her sculptures she created. She used her privilege, her wealth, her resources to develop her talent for sculpting, and use that wealth to support talented modern artists in the United States, like George Bellows and Charles Sheeler. These artists would form the foundation for the Whitney Museum's collection. Edward Hopper was one of her early discoveries. Gertrude was determined to promote art distinctive of the United States. So if you want to see the best of American modern art, you can do so at the museum bequeathed by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. As we have seen, many Vanderbilts spent lavishly on art and ended up auctioning it off so that they could simply live. Thankfully, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney made sure her patronage became a museum available to the public. Now, there are some Vanderbilts who ended up creating successful lives for themselves once the money was gone. Gloria Vanderbilt, the niece of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, ended up building a successful fashion empire. Gloria's son is award-winning journalist and CNN anchor Anderson Cooper. He is the Commodore Vanderbilt's sixth-generation descendant. He lives with the values of the patriarch, passed on to him by his mother, Gloria. Cooper says his mother told him early on in his life, "There is no trust fund for you." Well, he's done all right in his own right, freeing himself from many of the burdens of the Vanderbilt name. Today, no Vanderbilts are in any list of wealthy Americans. The lesson from the Commodore and his descendants: no matter how much money we have, it pays to live frugally, literally. No matter how much money we inherit, we should work hard to make our own contribution. And if we are going to blow our money away, then spend it on what will create a great legacy and impact our community, like education and art. Well, thank you very much for your attention this morning. Glad you could join us. If you would, I'm going to open it up and allow you to ask any questions you might have, or just to offer your thoughts or opinions on what you have heard this morning. And if you need me to go back to any slide, I will do that. Floor is now open.